Okay, let's call the meeting to order. Welcome to the Overview and Scrutiny Management Board. That's the second time I did that. It's not so bad. The first time I did it was on an entire tour with all the Southwest councillors. So I'll get straight into the agenda. First of all, welcome to everybody for coming along. I think we all know the health and safety processes, but just to remind everybody that we're not expecting to have any fire alarms. So if there is a fire alarm, please leave by the main doors and proceed down the ramp to the right to where the cathedral is. And then please wait to be signed off. Okay, apologies. Do we have apologies, Lucy?
Yes, Chair. So we've had apologies from Councillor Tim Kent, who's been subbed by Councillor Andrew Brown, and also from Councillor Graham Morris and Councillor Steve Pearce as well.
Thank you. Agenda item number 3 is declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? Okay, thank you. Moving swiftly on to agenda item number 4, minutes of previous meetings. We have 2 sets of minutes for OSM of the 7th of June, which was the work programme set in OSM, and OSM of 29th of March. Do we have any amendments or proposals? Barry?
Just got one amendment to the 7th of June. I was there. I'm not listed under the members present.
Apologies, Barry. And I think that was your first meeting as well. Okay, next item on the agenda is Chair's business. I have a brief statement to make. I note that we have received 2 statements that will be considered during public forum during this meeting, and these statements are from several councillors, in particular from members of People's Scrutiny. And he set out concerns about an issue in relation to SEND and social media. Within these statements, there is a suggestion that OSM be asked to request an investigation. I have been advised that officers are looking into this matter in order to establish the facts, and I would like to enable them to conclude this piece of work before we consider whether any additional action is necessary. Once I've been advised of the outcome of officers' inquiries, I intend to discuss next steps with the other OSM lead members. Clearly, this is a matter that has caused considerable distress to many parents as well as concern amongst councillors. And it is important that we, as a whole council, make every effort to ensure that the full facts are established as soon as possible. In addition, although this matter has been raised at OSM, clearly members of People's Scrutiny have specific knowledge and expertise within this topic and also need to be consulted regarding any further actions. Thank you. We'll now move on to public forum. Public forum includes 4 statements. The first statement is submitted on behalf of several councillors, and Councillor Brenda Massey, I believe you are going to speak to that statement.
Yes, thank you, Chair. As lead members on People's Scrutiny, we've been very concerned to read the accusations in the media that Bristol City Council has been engaged in monitoring, collecting and sharing information on SEND parents' social media posts and photos internally and externally. Such actions raise serious questions under the Regulation of Investigations Act 2000, brackets RIPA, and whether this activity, the motivation, and then the sharing of the information to external organisations was allowable. Secondly, there is a question over use of scarce resources. Do we think it's acceptable that the council are using scarce resources, in other words, officers' time, to carry out such activity? Thirdly, there is an issue of reputation and trust. In engaging in such activity, the council risks its reputation and trust not only with parents and residents of this city, but partners as well. Fourthly, the written statement of action constructed in response to the 2018 Ofsted inspection of SEND services highlighted relationships, trust and confidence of parents was a key area that needed improvement. People's Scrutiny and members as a whole have received monitoring reports from our senior officers that state this element of improvement was taking place. We've now been informed by the Bristol Parent Carer Forum that they did not request that Bristol City officers monitor SEND parents in such a way. We feel that this issue, given its damage to reputation and trust, does warrant an investigation by an external investigator who can report back to OSM. We would hope that such an investigation will look at the extent of any monitoring, whether this had any breach of our IPA, and what external organisations such monitoring was shared with and why. As you will be aware, People's Scrutiny does not meet again until September. We feel that is too late to start to address this issue and that such an investigation should be started as soon as possible. We make this request as the lead members of the Scrutiny Commission, but also make the request as a councillor call to action under the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act 2007 and the Police and Justice Act 2006. As there are no other opportunities for us to raise this in a public domain before September, we hope that our request as a call to action and that this issue be investigated externally and reported back to OSM with urgency is met. And this is signed by Councillor Tim Kent, Christine Townsend, Bales, Stone, Weston, Y, Bradshaw and myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Massey. We have further statements. Statement number 2 from Councillors Weston and Morris, which obviously OSM members would have read. And then we have 2 further statements on the livable neighbours for Worcester, which one is from Alan Morris on behalf of livable neighbours for Worcester, and the final statement from Ian Pond on behalf of the Worcester Cycling Campaign. I would like to assure them that those statements will be read and have been read by OSM members. Before I move on to public forum questions, was there any comments from any members of OSM? Councillor Gollop.
Thank you, Tony. I really wanted to comment on the statement from members of People's Scrutiny, which I thought was a really reasoned and balanced statement. And I have to say, I think the only thing we can do as OSM is to immediately request an inquiry. Members, I've already expressed to Tony my concerns that delaying this, I think, doesn't recognise the pressures that officers may well be under in this situation. I hope very much that no officer of this council would have instigated what happened without being told to do so. I find it unthinkable that this behaviour can be carried out in the name of the City Council, but it has been. And we need to know why. And if officers were told to do it by somebody else, they are not going to openly admit that in any internal inquiry. So I believe it is essential that we call for an independent inquiry, and that should be the view expressed by OSM in line with the leads on People's Scrutiny.
Thank you, Jeff. Councillor Brown.
Thanks. I've got a great deal of sympathy with your position, Chair, and the statement that you've made, but I do find myself in agreement with Councillor Gollop. It's, as things stand, the administration or the council is effectively marking its own homework, and I think we need something that's external and has a fresh and pair of eyes on this to get to the bottom of it.
Thank you. Is there any further comments? Councillor Bradshaw.
I just wanted to reiterate what Councillor Massey said, that this is for me an issue of confidence in the process. We've all dealt with send casework. Many of us will know the sincerity and the pressure that the families face. And this whole episode, or the allegations, have done no good and have added to that anxiety. So I share the view that there ought to be an urgent inquiry, and the sooner the better.
Thank you. I'm just going to briefly to respond. My position is that at present we have this item as a public forum item. Because it's a public forum item, there has not been the opportunity for other parties to have input, unless they were lucky enough, as we did as councillors, to get copies of the statement in advance. I agree that there is an urgent need to establish the facts, and I think we do need to have those facts established in such a way that is not just reliant on the media and Twitter. I am willing to ask Lucy to call for an Osm Leeds meeting at the earliest possible date, so that we can, as a group, establish our next steps forward. But I do think we also need to allow officers the opportunity to establish the facts that they are going to be looking into.
Thanks, Chair. So just to explain to members what's happening at the moment. So I received Councillor Kent's request to look into the matter on Thursday, which I've immediately progressed. The fact is, some key officers are away this week. It's not surprising this time of year that would happen. I've told Councillor Kent that therefore I expect to get back to him, and obviously I'll share it with yourself, Chair, next week. And I think once you've got the facts as we can establish them, as you say, you might be in a clearer position about what future course of action you might want to take. But I think it certainly, we would welcome the chance, as the Chair says, to gather the facts in the first instance, which we're currently doing.
Councillor Gollop.
Yeah, Tony, I just think that trying to have a further meeting, albeit of the Leeds, in the course of August is not going to be an easy exercise to undertake. I got the sense of discussion here that members felt very strongly that an independent inquiry was essential, and if that was the wish of Osm, I would suggest that we ask you and your deputy to recognise those comments and agree action with officers as soon as is feasible to go down that route, rather than delay, having to convene another meeting when others are back from holiday, find half of Osm Leeds are not available, and the process gets delayed. That time is of the essence in this, it's critical. So I'd be very happy to delegate to you and Mark if others shared that view.
Okay, so we put that to the vote then. Jeff, do you want to phrase that in the way in which is a motion for voting?
I'm very happy to. My suggestion is that we note the fact that members feel an independent inquiry is essential, recognise the need for further information to be gathered first, and that we delegate to Chair and Deputy Chair of Osm the ability to requisition, if that's the right word, an independent investigation.
Do I have a seconder? Councillor Massey. And all those in favour? That's carried. Can you note that? Okay, moving on to public forum questions. We have a question from Suzanne Audrey. regarding the Mayor's forward plan. A written response has been provided. We also have a question from Councillor Christine Townsend regarding the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman report. I'll refer back to that when we discuss that report. And then we also have a number of questions from Rob Wire regarding the Liverpool Neighbours Inquiry Day, and again, written responses have been provided. And that completes public forum. And let me find my place again. That brings us on to agenda item number 7, which is the annual business report, which I believe you're presenting, Lucy.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So, members, the recommendations in this report, then, they are mostly just for noting, and they're all as set out on the front sheet of the report. So you have recommendations A to E listed there. But I did just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So first of all, then, the dates for future meetings. So as you'll see in your report, you only have 3 OSM meetings programmed in at the moment. So just to let you know that we will be working with the Chair and the OSM leads to schedule in the remainder of the meeting. So that will be an additional 3 or 4 for this year, most probably. So as soon as we know when certain items on the work programme will be available, we will be looking to schedule those meetings in. Then the other thing to mention is that you do have a decision in this report as well, which is that you're being asked to establish the call-in subcommittee for this municipal year. So as you will see in the report, the proposed membership for that one is 6, and it's also suggested that the chairing of that body would rotate between the groups as set out in the report. So assuming you're happy with both of those things, I'd like to ask you then please to note the recommendations and approve the decision to set up the subcommittee, the call-in sub. Thank you.
Any comments from any councillor? I'll be therefore happy to accept the noting and approve as. Okay. You got power to go away with it, Lucy. Okay, that brings us on to agenda item number 8, which is the Local Government Ombudsman report. To give you the context for this, the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman issued a final decision report on the 4th of March 2022 regarding a complaint against Bristol City Council in relation to delays in the education, health and care process. The full report is set out in Appendix A of the document. One of the actions requested by the Ombudsman was that the Council agree within 3 months of the decision to send a copy of the final decision to the relevant Scrutiny Committee, so that there is democratic oversight of the extent of the problems affecting children and families waiting for EHC assessments in Bristol. Because the Ombudsman report was issued and published on the 4th of March, it was not practicable to formally report the decision to the 7th of March meeting of the People's Scrutiny Commission, which is where this would normally go. The next meeting of the People's Scrutiny Commission is on the 12th of September, so to avoid further delay in meeting the Ombudsman requests, the Chair of OSM and the Chair of the People's Scrutiny Commission have agreed that it is appropriate for the report to be submitted to this meeting of OSM. So a copy of the decision report is in the public domain as published by the Ombudsman and was also sent to members of the People's Scrutiny Commission following its publication. In response to a question earlier from Councillor Townsend, the response was that the Ombudsman's decision can also be reported to the People's Scrutiny Commission at their 12th of September meeting. At that time, the People's Scrutiny Commission has requested, in any event, that a persistent statement or update on progress in meeting the 20-week target for completing EHCP plans is submitted to that meeting. So it would be appropriate for the Ombudsman report to be discussed then, bearing in mind the context of the update report that will also be considered at that meeting. So with that in mind, all I'm asking for OSM to do today is to note the report, bearing in mind it would be going to People's Scrutiny for further discussion. Is that acceptable to everyone? Councillor Gollop.
Given that this has been an issue that's been concerning Osm and People's Scrutiny for some significant time. And given that, as I read the performance report later in the agenda, that after a period of catching up with the 20-week deadline, things appear to be slipping, if I read the figures correctly. I'm just wondering whether we might specify a few things that could perhaps be reported to People's Scrutiny in September. In particular, what I keep trying to get an understanding of is the number of long outstanding cases that could be similar to the case that resulted in this adjudication. We know that there are a number that have proved difficult and have been delayed, but I think it would be helpful to get a picture of how many other cases could be in similar circumstances to this, and it may only be that the family haven't complained. That's the reason why there's not an adjudication. So I think it would be useful if People's Scrutiny could understand more of that background, because there is a danger that we might have been attempting to achieve the 20-week compliance on new cases and not necessarily dealing with those that have been around for longer. And therefore, we need that information provided rather than the Commission having to ask for it in September and wait another 3 months for its next meeting.
Okay, Chair, thank you. And I believe Lucy has noted that. With that, oh, sorry, Councillor Massey. Sorry, Brenda.
It's okay, I'm invisible. I just wanted to echo some of the comments from Councillor Gollop, in that I know in my own ward I've got one case that's been outstanding for a very, very long time, and the parents are now threatening to take the council to court for non-provision and not meeting their child's requirements. So I think this is something that we really should be looking into a lot more closely.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. Any further comments from any other councillors? Okay. With those additional comments, I then propose we note the report and pass on our comments to People's Scrutiny and to officers. Okay, item number 9 is the Liverpool Neighbourhoods Inquiry Day, which is the draft scrutiny report. As many of you will know, we held quite an intensive inquiry day, which covered a wide range of areas. I am assuming, and if you haven't done, see me after SCUR, that you have all read the Liverpool Neighbours Inquiry Day report. We've also, I hope you have taken note of the questions that came through public forum regarding it. So what we are recommending for us and members to do is to note the contents of the report, approve the recommendations of the report, and approve the report for submission to Cabinet. I'm not sure which Cabinet we go to. It may not be the very next one. It could be next week. Depends how quickly we cover this today, I guess. So before we do that, I would like to provide the opportunity for any councillors to make any comments on the report. Councillor Wilcox.
Thank you, Councillor Dyer. I'd like to state that I welcome the report, and it's very useful. And I'm also glad that it has a definite note of that the controlled parking measures are necessary to deliver a successful livable neighbourhood. I don't know of any other livable neighbourhood that doesn't have controlled parking as part of it, and it's vitally important that the pilot does have that element.
Thank you, Councillor Wilcox. Before I go to Councillor Bradshaw, just to let other members know, we do have Jacob in the audience, who was with us for that inquiry day, and I think I may have delayed his presentation at one point because I couldn't find it. Apologies for that. So, Councillor Bradshaw.
Thanks, Chair. I thought the inquiry day was very helpful in terms of helping us all understand what had been achieved elsewhere, where Active Travel England is in terms of its thinking and its likely guidance, and then some practical interpretation for Bristol, because obviously not all neighbourhoods are the same and there isn't one single way to achieve this. What I really wanted to focus on is our shared capacity to deliver livable neighbourhood schemes, because they are intensive, they are expensive, whichever options you choose in terms of the severity of engineering. So, and knowing full well that the cost of anything involving engineering, construction, highways has significantly increased in terms of inflation and so on. So that's the first point I really wanted to highlight. The second is to endorse what David Wilcox just said about the demand management side of this. I don't see how you can achieve effective livable neighbourhoods without some degree of demand management being in the package. I just don't see how you can do it. And I think that goes across the whole range of options, from the heavy engineering to the very light touch. My last point is, of course, a lot of this is dependent on joint and shared working with WECA, who are obviously the recipients of a lot of the government funding. Some of the powers flow through WECA. The relationship with WECA has been somewhat turbulent. I'd like to see or understand how that will settle down, because I think that's pretty fundamental to delivering any of these schemes and indeed future schemes. And I'll just note that one of the London boroughs has announced plans to roll out over 400 cycle storage hangars. I think we're 20, 30, less. You know, this is the scale of, I think, what we've got to achieve. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mark. Before I come to Councillor Brown, I just want a couple of comments myself, which is maybe Jacob may be able to respond to, which is, as I understand it at the moment, we have the East Worcester livable neighbourhood pilot moving forward, and then, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're now moving on to a further stage of that. There's as it says in the report, there's a Labour manifesto commitment to livable neighbourhoods, and I think that is to have a second pilot up and running probably next year. At the same time, touching on something that Mark referred to, we are getting, I believe, £10 million plus £2 million of match funding towards livable neighbourhoods, but I believe there's a time limit on when that has to be spent. Are you able to respond to those comments?
Yes, let's have a point about
This one, here we go. That makes sense. Yeah, in terms of the resources for livable neighbourhoods, so we have resources for the two pilot areas through CRSTS. That's what you just talked about there, Tony, about the 10 million plus 2. So one of those areas will be the existing pilot area in East Bristol, and the other area which is yet to be identified yet. Both of those have to be delivered by 2027, I think, is the time frame on CRSTS. So yeah, that's the position we're at the moment with funding and resource.
So just to come back on that, is that 10 to 12 million just for those two pilots, or is it expected that it will cover considerably more?
Just for those two initial pilots.
Okay, thank you. Adam?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it obviously depends on how much each pilot costs, inflation, things like that, but we have a 12 million allocation for livable neighbourhoods. So if it ends up being 3, it's 3, you know, it depends on the size and the kind of detail of what you put into the different areas.
Okay, thank you. I have Councillor Brown and then Councillor Massey.
Thank you, Chair. I endorse the previous comments that have been made. The other thing I remember being mentioned on the day, and I can't remember quite the strength of it, but and I've not really seen in the report, is about mitigation measures for people who are on the edges of any given scheme against either real or perceived effects of traffic displacement or whatever. So something that includes those. But also, I think my overarching impression on the day is that these are expensive and they need to be substantial and comprehensive to be effective. And I'm worried about trials with non-permanent solutions, which they'll need to be very carefully designed so as not to damage the reputation of low traffic neighbourhoods, have unexpected adverse effects, and damage the whole programme.
Thank you, Andrew. I don't know if any of the officers wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll be looking at what potential impacts there might be around the edges. That there is a limit as to what mitigations you can do around the edges of the zones. I mean, if you look at East Bristol, for example, Church Road has been designed. It was a while ago when we did Showcase 2, but we will look at the existing layouts of the traffic lights as part of the schemes and see what else we can do along those corridors. But there will always be a limit to what we can do on the edges of zones in terms of major interventions.
Councillor Massey.
Thank you. I found it a really helpful day. It was very interesting. And I think one of the comments in there about the improvements can actually be small scale, such as planting trees and providing more benches. That's actually what my residents have been asking for. And it's interesting how much of a difference that can make to an area. We've recently had our Arnside shopping centre revamped, and it's like a different place now. It's made such a difference to it. It really is. And that's not huge. I mean, it was quite big, but it just shows you how people can enjoy living in their neighbourhoods with sort of relatively small tweaks to it. So that was great. And I found it was a really interesting day, even though I did catch COVID for the first time in 2 years that day.
I apologise personally for that, Councillor Massey. Any other comments, Councillor Parsons?
Yeah, I've got a question for the officers. We heard on the day, and we've heard today from other members and from the public about some elements of the handbook which were considered to be missing, like the demand management. I was wondering whether those elements are going to be included in the next iteration of the handbook, and whether you're able to give us any indication now of what the approach to demand management, to parking management is going to be.
I mean, do you mean demand management? Are you referring specifically to parking? Because demand management for the city as a whole is an interesting subject, and it's one that needs to be discussed definitely in the context of reducing carbon dioxide emissions, particularly. In terms of the handbook, follow our current line, which is that if there is a widespread interest in parking restrictions of some sort, then we're happy to look at them. We'll obviously have to make sure that there isn't an impact on surrounding areas. And also we do need to take into consideration the whole question of whether renting out highway to people to store their cars is actually a progressive move towards getting rid of cars or lowering the number of cars, however we want to see it, because I don't always follow that line of argument, but by all means discuss it. By all means put it in there if you've got particular reflections on it. It's your handbook,
And I think, just to clarify, when Councillor Alexander says it's your handbook, he's referring to it's been Councillor's handbook.
Always been for councillors to reflect on their experience. Obviously with officers, we're not going to have an open document. Anyone can write anything in from the city. To work with officers, their reflections, their learning, the tools they used, so that people like me who haven't got a livable neighbourhood in their area can take it to their communities and discuss what happened, go through it, and see if there's an appetite elsewhere. Learn from mistakes and learn from things that went right. It's a public document and it's your document. Yeah, but it's not a strategy document. Let's be clear, it's not a strategy for the city, either in terms of demand management or in terms of where future livable neighbourhoods are. That was never the intention. That strategy rests with the administration, mind me, and the mayor. But this is for our learning, and I should be glad to see the contents of it.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander. Any further comments or questions? Okay, in that case, can I ask us and members to note the content of the report, approve the recommendations of the report, and approve the report for submission to Cabinet? Do I have any objections? All in favour, say aye. Almost like full council then. Just would like to say thank you to Jacob, Adam and Don. Thank you for the effort you put in on the day as well. Just to support what Brenda said, it was a very useful and very interesting day, and even if we didn't get all the presentations done in the time we wanted to get them done, they were very useful. So thank you for all the work you put into that. We'll now move on to item number 10, which is the quarterly performance progress report. This is for Q4 21-2022, and I would like to welcome Tim Barrett to the meeting, who will be presenting the report. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Just a few words of introduction to this report, which I'll take largely as read and try not to recite to you, but just some reminders about the performance reporting process and what this represents. For where we are in the year, it probably feels slightly odd to be looking back to our previous corporate strategy and business plan, but as this is the final quarter of last year's outturn, the new corporate strategy took effect from the 1st of April 22. So for the purposes of this report, we're casting our minds back to the Council's previous corporate strategy and last year's business plan. This focuses very much on KPIs. You'll be aware that earlier this year we approved a new performance framework and approach to performance, which means that in future these updates to you will have a little more narrative to them, some more milestone tracking as well as KPIs. We'll also be working with the Chair and with yourselves to hopefully identify in advance of meetings areas you'd like to pay particular attention to, so that we can invite the appropriate officers to come and speak to you about specifics of performance. But in terms of quarter four outturn, it's a bit of a game of two halves. It's around halfway through what we'd expect for the targets in terms of performance. So 45% of all the measures in our annual business plan with targets were performing on or better than target at the end of the financial year. Of those, around half of the citywide measures, which are those where the council has some impact but not every lever to pull, and 38% of the measures which we could attribute to council-specific activity were on targets. Comparatively, 50% of those business plan measures compared with the 12 previous months were improved or the same. So that does mean that the other half, of course, will have gone in the wrong direction and got worse to one degree or another. Last year was a slightly unusual year probably for target setting, and some of what we saw come forward in the targets throughout the year, having had the unpredictability and the knock-on impact of the pandemic moving into an element of recovery while still living with COVID. There was a greater level of uncertainty in a lot of our target setting, but nevertheless that sort of half and half picture of outturn against target is relatively consistent with what we've seen in the last few years. So it's not a completely unfamiliar picture for us. In terms of the KPIs themselves, you'll see throughout the report some of them particularly highlighted. I can help where I can with some of the background to those, but obviously we would need to refer you to the specific officers and those services for a more detailed breakdown. A couple I did want to highlight are where we might have some slightly more counterintuitive responses. So you'll see under empowering and caring, The contact for adult social care who received Tier 1 and 2 services was seen as below target, 47%, which had been consistent throughout the year. But actually that's been attributed to positive contact with local voluntary services and people being signposted to those services directly without going via the council. So actually, although the target on that is below target, it's actually probably indicative of better outcomes for people. Another one I wanted to highlight is the KPI of consultation responses, particularly the ratio of response rates between those living in the least and most deprived areas. We saw a very high response rate to a couple of surveys last year, which has actually brought that well onto target in a way that we have struggled to do in the last few years. The learning from that really is you get what you pay for. So those consultations were of sort of much higher interest topics. Some of them had specific funding behind them for outreach and engagement activity. So that is demonstrative of where we put that extra investment in. We do get that better balance of response, but that investment is significant and not something that's easily replicated across every consultation. So we would expect performance there to revert slightly in Q1 onwards this year, as we don't have the same level of funded activity. Just in terms of some of the organisational priorities and the business KPIs, again, you'll see some of the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic there, an impact on council tax collection, as with business rates were slightly below, an equivalent to a deficit of 9.4 million on the council tax collection side. More positively, you did see an improvement in our spend with small and medium-sized enterprises, which was greater than the UK average, which is a positive sign. Challengingly, we did start to see levels of sickness towards the end of the year upticking, potentially from some of the impacts of living with COVID and the excess pressure in particular being a rising cause of sickness. And similarly, the turnover rate, although only just outside of sort of a healthy target range, has crept up to 15.3%, and 15% is generally where we consider the upper level of a healthy target for turnover. So some trends there that members may wish to be mindful of as they look ahead at how performance develops during this year. We will be with you again for the Q1 of this year as soon as we can. We're aware of the timeliness of these reports isn't always ideal following the sort of fairly long decision pathway that we have here. This does feel a bit retrospective at times, so we will be working on new approaches to try to get things a bit more timely during this year, and also develop some dashboard products which are live, which members will have access to at any time, just to try and present a slightly more up-to-date view of performance. And as I say, hopefully at these meetings in future, some deeper dives into some topics of interest, which we'll be discussing with the Chair and Awesome Leads to help you get the most value from these sessions. But with that said, happy to take any questions, and I may in majority need to field answers from officers, but happy to take those down and help where I can.
Thanks, Tim. That's very useful, and yeah, I'm looking forward to all the new toys you're going to be bringing into this going forward. Do I have any comments or questions? Councillor Wilcox.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Tim, for a very comprehensive report. Can I make a small suggestion about the production of the report? Would it be possible to replicate the yellow row at the top of page 62 of our bundle that actually lists what the column titles is further on each of the pages, because it makes it a lot easier to read?
It certainly is. I must say, I've seen that myself once or twice and made a mental note, so I'll make a physical note this time and we'll get that updated for you.
So to get to a question, BCP 475, which has increased the number of passenger journeys on buses, it's still only 70% of pre-pandemic levels. Issues with bus reliability and driver availability are putting people off using bus transport. How will the council be working with the operators to improve this, especially in the light of the WECA bus deal negotiations, please? Perhaps Councillor Alexander can answer that one for you if he's still behind you.
If he's still behind me, that's one where I would say I would defer to my colleagues in transport, but as Councillor Alexander is with us, I don't know if he wants to.
I'm the only one left, unfortunately. We have very, very regular meetings with the officers from WECA, meet also with my fellow cabinet members from the unitary authorities within WECA, meet with First, and I've got breakfast with Stagecoach on Friday. The problem is drivers. There are many other issues longer term, but in the short term, it's drivers. They assure me of that. It's a national problem, and it's very, very difficult to get around that. And until we can get around that, then there is going to be a kind of halted improvement after COVID. I think it's interesting that a lot of the people who do not seem to have returned to the buses are the concessionary travellers. So whether those people still feel concerned about the dangers of the pandemic, perhaps rightly, or whether they have just found different patterns of socialising is really interesting. But also this is challenging for the buses, and I constantly come back to the fact that we need to have the best possible segregated infrastructure for public transport in this city. We're facing every other challenge, and we cannot ask operators to get their buses through crowded streets with modes all mixed up, and with parking on the sides, and etc. etc. We've got to put a lot of energy into creating segregated infrastructure for buses. That's the thing that we can do, whilst I continue to work with WECA and with the bus operators, having very limited influence, obviously, in that.
Thank you, Don. I've got one more about BPB 350, which is the drop in the number of people who are satisfied with council services. It's a 25% drop. Can I have some information about how the administration is intending to address this change, please?
Yeah, thank you. We'll get a written answer from the appropriate people for that. I would say we saw an overall decline in quality of life responses in the annual survey this year. We saw quite a large uptick during the pandemic itself. And I think this year we saw a generally more negative response. It's always difficult to extrapolate exactly what that means, whether that is a general expression of dissatisfaction in the environment. I think that may have been a factor this time. But I would say our satisfaction rates have been consistently at those sorts of levels. That is a challenge for the council. And of course, that's an issue of both practice and perception. So I will make sure that we get a written answer to you. But if there's any further reflections, I'll make sure we share it there.
Thank you.
Councillor Brown, and then Councillor Birdsall.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions you might have to take away. But the first was on page 63 on BPC 352B about the number of people sleeping rough. The latest figure given in that is 45. But at audit committee yesterday, when we were looking at the draft statement of accounts, it gave a figure of 26 in what was described as, if I can just get this up, the national annual count recorded in January. So I just wondered if, is maybe a different methodology being employed, or just the vagaries of, different dates and, the sort of patterns of availability of hostels and beds elsewhere.
Yeah, I'm afraid we will need to take that offline and get an answer to you. If there's the same count, there could be as simple as an admin error, but of course any count is a one night count, so it's what it finds on the night. But we'll double check the detail for you and confirm.
Thank you. Yeah, it was just, it looked low it seemed like a low figure, and when I was looking at the report, but I had no reason to question it, and because it's so out of kilter with all those figures, I So I'd ask. The other one I was going to raise is on page 64, BPB 124A. There's a line that says the number of decisions, 44, for the year to date are down on 2020 to 21 when 38 had been issued. That doesn't tally unless it's a smaller percentage of overall. Sorry, yeah, so it's page 64, the top one, BPB 124A, percentage of major residential planning applications processed.
Yeah, I'm afraid I will need to check that for you offline again.
Okay,
That's
thank you.
not an area I know off the top of my head, sorry.
Councillor Bradshaw.
Thanks, Chair. Again, this is one you might need to take back, Tim. This one relates, again, I think on page 64. It's BPB 375, which is about the reduction of the number of empty council properties. I do understand the impact of COVID and the disruption that has caused, but I'm particularly interested in how we deal with voids going forward, how quickly we can turn them round, because obviously it provides a home for one of the 16,000 or so people on the housing waiting list. It's also income for the housing revenue account as well. And that I'm assuming that we have a unified team that will go into a void to turn it around, make any improvements, refurbishments, repairs. I think there was talk at one point of Bristol Waste being part of those teams as well. But I'd just be interested in how we're tackling this going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I will take that offline and get an answer from the housing team for you. Just to say, from my perspective, from the forums I'm in with the Director of Housing, I know it is a particular area of focus alongside temporary accommodation. So there is some concerted work that is being done there, and I'll make sure that they get a brief to you. And again, as a reminder on these reports, we're very happy to provide the draft. So if there are areas like this that you'd actually maybe want a bit of a deeper dive or briefing during these meetings, as long as we have a few days' notice, we'll make sure we bring the officers with us to do that at future updates.
Thank you. Now also segues nicely into my comment, which was I think we've just illustrated why, part of the reason why Tim and I are having these discussions about how we can make this more useful for both members and for Tim and other teams, is by getting together so that we can identify those areas where we have particular interests, so that officers are able to provide the detailed answers instead of poor Tim having to be sent back with little notes and so on. And also, as Tim has mentioned, providing the opportunity for us to do a deep dive into particular areas of interest. But thank you, Tim, for coming along. I think we now move directly on to item number 11, which is the Corporate Risk Management Report for Q1 for 2022-2023. We have Paul Jury with us to respond to questions. Thank you for coming along, Paul. I think for one or two of us, myself, David and Andrew, this may be a case of deja vu, because we've gone over those figures, I think, previously in audit and elsewhere. So I'm looking to the rest of you to come forward with some more interesting questions than we were able to come up with. So with that in mind, who wants to go first? Councillor Bradshaw.
Hiya. My question, it relates to CRR40, the unplanned investment in subsidiary companies. And I wanted to better understand this because as I grasp this, the governance arrangements have changed. Bristol Holding Limited is now not the primary assurance vehicle for company business plans and across the so-called group. This is now for the individual companies. And I just wanted to understand the scale of this pressure and risk and who is now doing the assurance. And if I look at the existing controls, on item 4 in the list, it says effective engagement with BHL, which I assume is Bristol Holdings Limited, which I don't think really exists anymore other than on paper. So could you explain how the assurance for this and say the kind of general scale of the risk? Because it is a bit alarming to read.
Thanks for your question. I'm just making notes on that frantically as you were going along these questions there. Probably one I have to revert back to the risk owner in relation to provide a full and complete response on that one. There is a brief synopsis of the summary of the progress of the risk below the risk itself, but I don't think that quite captures your question, so I'm more than happy to refer that one on to the risk owner and get you a written, detailed response.
And I think I may be able to help you with refining that question, because I think I know what Mark is referring to, so I'll communicate that with you as well, if Mark's okay with that. Do we have any further questions? Councillor Wilcox, I was hoping you put your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I've got a question about CRR 41, because it seems to have changed its character of its risk. In the Q4 risk report, CRR 41 is referred to long-term major capital projects. And now the title of it's changed to capital portfolio delivery. And it seems to have a whole new load of actions that are associated with it. Can you describe why the risk has changed in this way, please?
We performed a rebaseline of risks during the last quarter, so that was included in-depth analysis with the risk owners around the title descriptions and titles themselves. And we felt like the original risk didn't actually capture the description of the risk itself. It was more because long-term major capital project in itself isn't a risk, but the risk of failure to deliver them is. That's why we've changed the title in relation to that one. Any feedback on, sort of thoughts on?
But you don't mention that in the your preamble on page 81 of the risk report.
We'll make sure that we capture any...
It'd be really useful if you did, because I wouldn't be asking this question if you classified that information there.
That's fine. We'll recapture that information going forward.
Councillor Gollop.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that, and apologies to members of the Audit Committee for me subbing at the June meeting, but the June meeting had a value for money report from the auditors that referred to a number of issues relating to the capital programme, including the peculiar cyclical nature that saw something like 3/4 of the capital spend happening in Q4 of each year. And it just seemed to me that having had that report, to have this without any comment referring to that report and the actions recommended from that report suggests that the risk is being identified differently by those who manage risk than by those who manage the capital projects, and that seems unfortunate.
I think it's a fair comment. Jeff, we also had a comment about this in audit yesterday, which I'll follow up on.
Chair, I mean, the people involved in the exercise that Paul was just referring to are the people managing the capital programme. The same people are involved, so there is consistency of involvement in that activity. So, Jeff, maybe you can explain are you suggesting there's an inconsistency between the risk assessment and the discussion at the Audit Committee, which I wasn't party to?
I'm suggesting that the auditor's value for money report highlighted a number of issues that are consistent with it being a risk for the register, but actually the risks in the register are totally different to the ones referred to in the auditor's report, and that seems an inconsistency. I would have expected there to be a linkage between the two, given that the value for money report was highlighting risks that the authority should be responding to. I'd assume that the response would be to pick them up in the corporate risk register.
I think there is commonality here, and it may just be about the way that they've been described. But perhaps, Paul, we can I don't know if you want to add anything now, but perhaps we can talk to Stephen Peacock and others about explaining how the two things do link together, because I know the issues have been considered together. I don't know, Paul.
I think it's worth noting as well, I haven't seen that copy of that report myself, but this is purely relating to strategic risks. So it's it would cover more broad topics and sort of operational risks that may have been identified in a separate report into that matter. So it's worth bearing that in mind as well.
Yeah, we'll follow that up with that, Jeff, and get Stephen involved in that as well. Thank you. Do Councillor Parsons?
Thanks. Yeah, I have a question about a newly added risk, which is BCCC 5, the cost of living crisis impact on citizens and communities. A couple of questions about this one, really. One is, I mean, clearly the cost of living crisis is a kind of a new and growing threat to the city, but I wonder whether you could maybe explain a little bit about the kind of the rationale for this one and what makes it specific. There's a whole load of other risks, homelessness, for example, which are kind of potentially kind of included within this one. And my other question about this one was around the controls and the mitigations. I don't see anything in there about citizens' access to money, which is one of the key things that I think is going to determine the impact on people. Things like the Crisis Prevention Fund, I don't see in there. So I was wondering whether you could maybe expand a bit on the kind of the reasoning for including this one and how we're going to be able to measure it and control it effectively.
In relation to your first point, this is captured as an external risk, meaning that it's an external risk to our organisation, whereas the others would be captured as internal risks, meaning that they're more sort of subject matters that we can have an impact on directly. So it is worth capturing this, because during our decision pathway process, we go out to all relevant teams and sort of capture the biggest risks on their impact in their strategic objectives. And it was identified commonly throughout the organisation that the cost of living crisis and the impacts on citizens and communities was having an impact to their strategic objectives. In relation to the mitigating actions around providing funds to citizens, I'm more than happy to discuss that with the risk owner to see if anything is in that space, but the actions and existing controls are captured by the risk owner, so I'm more than happy to revert that one to them.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, I think the other comment I would make about the external risk of the cost of living is that some of the factors affecting the cost of living, or as captured in that risk, are things beyond the control of us as Bristol City Council, so inflationary pressures, for instance. So I think that's part of the reason why it's an external risk, but it may contain elements that are separately recorded, because those are things we can directly affect as a council or as a city.
Can I just add, Chair, and it's only given in summary form, but if you look at the summary of progress, then there is reference there to the work that's been done with city partners to ensure that as far as possible citizens are getting access to advice, food, the BCC revs and bends, and so that is shorthand for the provision by the council directly of financial support where it's appropriate, but also the signposting to the various agencies that can help citizens with those issues. So that is very much part of the activity. It's here obviously in a very summary form, because as Paul says, this is a strategic document. I think members have had an all-member briefing on the work around cost of living crisis. I think Penny German, I don't know if you're able to make that, but I think that went into a bit more detail about the kind of support that we're trying to give. But I guess I'm trying to reassure you that that is very much at the forefront of what we're trying to do.
And I think also add to that, there was a piece by Denise Murray, which also talked about support and services that can be assessed for people being affected by the cost of living crisis. As there are no more questions that I can see, thank you, Paul, for coming along. It was very useful. We now move on to agenda item number 12. This is one of our standing items, which is the Mayor's forward plan. It's for noting, but Councillor Gollop, I believe you have a comment?
Well, actually, I did, but I think it was going to come in the next item on the work programme was one comment, but I did have two comments on the forward plan. One is that we were told when we were briefed on the heat network that there was a further proposal coming to a cabinet meeting regarding City Leap, and that I can't see any reference to City Leap in the forward plan, which surprises me, as that was what we were assured.
I'll have to get back to you on that one, because I was aware there is something going forward. It may be the way it's worded.
But I am right that that was what we were told when we had that meeting.
Yes, my understanding is there is something coming to Cabinet.
Okay, so that was
November.
that was one, and then the other is a very parochial issue because it goes through my ward. But there was the consultation on the number 2 bus route happened much earlier this year. We keep trying to find out when we're going to get some feedback from it, and all I see from here is that there is an outline business case and a business case coming sometime before April. I'm sort of guessing that the outline business case may come before the full business case, but I can't be certain, and I'm surprised there isn't a third, given we usually find things to do with buses come in threes. But it would be really helpful, given that that route goes through a significant number of wards of members, if we could actually have an indication of the timings, and it would even be more helpful if we could have a little bit of consultation before it's published. So, just having it appearing before April is not helpful. So if you were able to intercede on behalf of those members who are affected, Tony, I think it would be much appreciated.
I'll do my best, Jeff. Also, Lucy just reminded me that we are going to be getting a briefing on City Leap. I think we're in the process for arranging and setting up, so there will be some more information coming to Osm about City Leap in the relatively near future. And that may include some additional information. Well, it will include some additional information. Any more comments on the Mayor's forward plan? Okay. So that's noted. Item number 13, another standing item, is the WECA Overview Scrutiny Committee minutes. Which are just for noting. We're assuming that the WECA committee, and Brenda will probably tell me if it hasn't, has recorded their minutes correctly, so we'll note that. And then item number 14.
Can I just make a point there of the slight confusion that manages to surround things to do with WECA, is that there is a joint committee meeting on Friday at midday. The only item on the paper, on the agenda, is to do with the Portage headline. So I avidly started to try and read through the papers to find out what it was, and there are no papers. So there is asked for the Chair of Scrutiny to make a comment, but Scrutiny can't see the report because we don't know what it is. So I'm just giving you that background. I understand in this case it is possible. It's not WECA's fault that this is delayed. But I just thought members should be aware that it sort of, the deficit of members being able to comment on anything to do with WECA continues. Noted, and I have to say, my understanding is that it was very late notice about that meeting as well, and the fact there are no papers, I think, is something that is concerning for us in Bristol as well. Okay, item number 14 is the work programme, and this time, Jeff, I believe you did want to make a comment. My apologies for usurping you earlier. 2 points, Tony. The first one is an issue that I am keen on our scrutiny of our limited companies. I think it should be proportionate, so it shouldn't be more than we would give if we were delivering those services ourselves, but we should expect a level of openness which we'd expect from within the authority. So I find it very strange to discover that the Managing Director and Finance Director of Bristol Waste have been replaced at short notice with no explanation and no ability for Scrutiny to have any awareness of what's going on. So I'm putting that on record and indicating that I would expect us to have a briefing and an explanation at some stage in the very near future. The second issue, and again apologies to members of Audit Committee, but I can't help but read the papers. And I did notice in the draft annual accounts that there was on the salaries section, there is one very significant payment or cost for one senior employee, and that cost was something like 60% more than the Chief Executive's cost. Now, I realise this is an HR committee matter, but it is such a significant sum that I think members, either through Osm or Resources, should be looking at that policy because it doesn't seem acceptable. So I'm registering my views, and if other members share those views, perhaps we should decide where it goes. And that can be taken to a Leeds meeting, but I'm just putting on record now that it was something I looked at and felt very uncomfortable with.
Okay, thanks, Jeff, and noted. Obviously, I'm not going to comment on a single individual, so it may be something that we can discuss in exempt section or in Osm Leeds rather than in public. I believe there is a part explanation for the high amount, which is, but we'll discuss that under Osm Leeds. Thank you. Are there any more comments about the work programme? Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the agenda and the end of the meeting. Thank you all very much for coming along and for your comments and questions. Thanks also to Councillor Alexander to be here to the bitter end, as well as our Chief Executive. I think today was a difficult meeting for various reasons, and I hope that as a group and as a council in general, we can resolve some of the issues that are being brought to our attention as soon as possible. And bearing in mind that our main reason for being here is to create a better Bristol and also create an environment that is better for the people that live in this city. With that, I'd just like to thank you for the efforts and the time you've all put in. Thank you.